My name is William Bill Carter, and I was a sergeant in the 1st Cavalry Division during the Vietnam War. I first set foot in Vietnam in 1965, right out of high school. I was only 18 at the time. The year was 1966 when I was stationed in the Central Highlands, far from home, far from anything familiar. I remember being nervous as hell when I first got to the base, but we all were. It's funny, you think that the fear of war will hit you when you land, but it doesn't. It sneaks up on you slowly, like the humidity that weighs on your chest. And before you know it, you're living with it every day. I was part of a reconnaissance platoon. Our job was to patrol the dense jungle and mountains, looking for signs of the enemy. We were constantly moving, always on edge. The heat and the constant buzzing of insects made everything feel suffocating. But it was the quiet that really got to you. You'd spend hours walking through thick underbrush, barely making a sound, and then nothing. Silence. For a guy from a small town in Kentucky, that silence was the most unnatural thing I'd ever experienced. It didn't feel right. We were about 2 weeks into a mission when we got orders to move out. A small village had been hit by Viet Cong fighters. There were rumors about a major VC supply route running through the area, and we were to check it out. The briefing wasn't much, just another day in the jungle, another day of searching. But I could feel it in my gut. Something didn't feel right. Our team was made up of about a dozen of us, mostly young guys like me, just trying to do our job. Sergeant Davis, a grizzled guy from Philly who had seen a lot of action, was in charge. He had a way of getting you to listen when he spoke. Not because he yelled, but because he was steady. The kind of guy you could trust with your life. Then there was Private Jenkins, this young kid who barely knew how to hold an M16. He was fresh out of boot camp, and you could tell by the way he looked around at every tree, every shadow. He wasn't ready for the jungle. He was a good kid, though. We started moving before dawn. The plan was simple: get into the village, gather intel, and get out before the VC knew we were there. Everyone was nervous, but that was nothing new. Nervous energy was a constant companion in Vietnam. We'd learned how to ignore it for the most part. It was the kind of thing you shoved down deep inside and pushed forward with. We made it about halfway to the village when the first shot rang out. It wasn't loud at first, more like a whisper cutting through the air. It was an AK-47, the distinctive crack of the rifle echoing through the trees. Sergeant Davis immediately shouted for everyone to take cover, but it was too late. A second shot hit Jenkins. He went down hard, his body jerking before he even hit the ground. I'll never forget the sound of him screaming. It was a sound I had never heard before, a sound that I would never unhear. We didn't have time to react, though. The jungle exploded in noise, more shots, yelling from the trees. The VC were on us, and they knew the terrain better than we did. The first few moments were chaotic. You could hear the crack of enemy rifles from all sides, and the sickening thud of bullets hitting flesh. I grabbed Jenkins, trying to drag him to cover. But the jungle had already swallowed us whole. I couldn't see much through the thick foliage, but I knew the enemy was close. You could feel their presence like a pressure in the air. Sergeant Davis was shouting orders, trying to get us organized, but everything was happening so fast. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with my M16. The heat, the sweat, the fear, it all hit me in a wave. We managed to find cover behind a fallen tree. I pulled Jenkins close, trying to stop the bleeding, but there was so much blood. Too much blood. His eyes were wide with fear, but he wasn't screaming anymore. He was trying to speak, but all that came out was a choking sound. Then we heard something that would change everything. A voice. It wasn't coming from our side. It was a voice, a low, almost calm sound, but it was unmistakable. It was in English. "Bill, is that you?" I froze. The voice wasn't just any voice. It was my old buddy, Dave Martin. He had been with me during training, and we'd been separated after our unit was rotated out. We had been looking for each other ever since. He had been assigned to a different unit, but the jungle had a way of bringing people together, even in the middle of a firefight. I pushed myself up, trying to get a glimpse of where the voice had come from. Through the smoke and the trees, I saw him. Dave was crouching low, his M16 ready, just like old times. But there was something else. He wasn't alone. He had a group with him, a small squad of soldiers. They had been sent out on a different mission, but had ended up in the same spot. Over here! I yelled. Dave's squad charged forward, cutting through the jungle, and I couldn't help but feel a rush of relief. But that relief was short-lived. The VC had us pinned down, and the noise was deafening. The first few moments of chaos had turned into a full-blown firefight. Dave's squad was quick to get into position, returning fire. But it wasn't enough. We needed to move. We needed to get Jenkins out of there. I looked at Sergeant Davis, and he nodded at me. Without a word, he made a decision. We weren't going to wait for reinforcements. We weren't going to wait for the next round of attacks. We had to move, and we had to move now. We started dragging Jenkins toward the jungle's edge, with enemy bullets tearing through the air around us. The sound of their AK-47s was like a never-ending storm. I couldn't think, couldn't focus on anything except the sound of Jenkins gasping for air. It felt like the whole world was closing in on me. Then, out of nowhere, a grenade exploded. The blast was so close that it nearly knocked me off my feet. I had no idea what had happened. All I knew was that I was on the ground, my ears ringing. When I looked up, the world was spinning, and for a moment, I thought I had been hit. But I wasn't. I didn't have time to dwell on it. We had to move. We had to get Jenkins to safety. The firefight raged on, but we were making progress. Dave's squad was pushing forward, covering our retreat. Sergeant Davis was barking orders, keeping us moving. But every step felt like it might be our last. The jungle was alive with gunfire, and the whole world felt like it was crashing down on us. I don't know how long we were under fire. Time seemed to stretch and warp, like it didn't exist anymore. What I do know is that when we finally made it back to the extraction point, Jenkins was gone. He didn't make it. We were all covered in dirt, sweat, and blood. The jungle that had once felt like a place of uncertainty now felt like a death trap, a place that had claimed another one of us. I don't think any of us ever really talked about what happened that day. Not in the way we should have. But I remember it. I remember every detail. And I'll never forget what it was like moving through that jungle, knowing that at any moment any one of us could be next. After that day, things started to feel different. The way I saw my brothers in arms, my comrades, they were still the same, but everything felt heavier. We were all changed by the bloodshed, the silence, and the constant tension that clung to us like sweat. Sergeant Davis, who had been so calm before, started getting more withdrawn. I remember catching him staring into the jungle one night, just sitting by the fire, not saying a word for hours. We'd all sit there in silence, like we didn't know what to say to each other anymore. How do you talk about what happened? How do you talk about the fact that we had just watched one of our own die? Jenkins was the first, but he wouldn't be the last. That's the thing about Vietnam. You never knew who was going to go next. The jungle was unforgiving. And the VC? They knew it like the back of their hand. They knew when to strike, where to strike, and how to vanish before you even knew they were there. We were always looking over our shoulders, wondering if the next step would be our last. We stayed in the area for another week, moving through the dense underbrush, trying to find more of the VC forces. But it was like chasing shadows. Every time we thought we had them cornered, they'd slip away. And we were running low on food and ammo. Things were starting to get desperate. On the 5th day after Jenkins died, we got word that a bigger operation was coming in. We were to link up with a larger force, a division from the 25th Infantry, and sweep the area for VC supply lines. But even though I knew it was the only way to survive, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just another mission where we were going to lose more good men. I was walking point that day. It was my job to lead the way and make sure no one got blindsided. The thick jungle was as quiet as ever, and I remember feeling like I was walking in someone else's shoes, like I wasn't even there. The whole world felt numb. We were about 2 miles from the village we were supposed to link up with when it happened. A crack of a rifle shot echoed through the trees, and the world exploded around me. I hit the dirt immediately, instinct kicking in. The shot came from my right, and it wasn't just one. There were more. They had us in a crossfire. The VC had been waiting for us. They knew we were coming. I could hear Sergeant Davis yelling for us to take cover, but the noise was deafening. The sound of gunfire, the shuffling of boots through the jungle, the screeching of the jungle's wildlife. Everything blended together into a deafening roar. My ears were ringing, but I kept low to the ground, moving slowly. I knew if I stood up or tried to run, I wouldn't make it. I was pinned down. In that moment, all I could think about was staying alive. The jungle felt alive with the enemy. They were everywhere, and they knew where we were. I tried to steady my breath, my heart pounding in my chest, and raise my M16. I fired off a few rounds in the general direction of the gunfire, but I couldn't see anything through the trees. The worst part was, it wasn't just the sound of their rifles. It was the way they communicated. They had their own system, quick, efficient, no wasted words. It sounded like a language I'd never heard before, sharp and direct. It was unsettling to know they were out there talking to each other, moving in sync, and we were just guessing. Sergeant Davis ordered us to move left, toward a small hill where we could get some higher ground. But just as we were making a move, the ground erupted with explosions. Claymore mines. The first one went off so close that I felt the shockwave rip through my body. My ears were deafened for a second. I could taste the dirt in my mouth, and my face was covered in the smoke from the explosion. It didn't stop there. More blasts followed, and the chaos became unbearable. The earth trembled beneath my feet, and all I could do was move, instinctively crawling toward any kind of cover. My M16 had fallen from my hands during the explosion, but I didn't stop. I found a rock and pulled myself behind it, shaking all over. When I looked up, I saw a flash of movement through the trees. I didn't have time to aim, but I fired anyway. The muzzle flash from my rifle lit up the smoke-filled air. The shot went wide, but it was enough to make the VC soldier retreat back into the shadows. I couldn't think, couldn't focus on anything except survival. The battle lasted for what felt like hours, though it could have been much less. I don't even know how many of us made it out unscathed. But when the firing stopped and the smoke cleared, I saw something that I will never forget. A body, lying in the dirt. It was Private Thompson, one of the newer guys from our squad. He had been with us only a few months, but he had already proven himself a brave man. He wasn't the only one down. We had lost others. But Thompson's death hit me harder than I expected. He was just a kid, barely 18, and he was gone. I remembered his face from earlier, how eager he was when he first arrived. I remembered how he looked up to us, how he tried to laugh off his fear when the shooting started. And now he was just another casualty of this damn war. The rest of us managed to drag ourselves to the rendezvous point. When we finally linked up with a larger unit, I didn't feel any relief. It was like we had traded one nightmare for another. The 25th Infantry did their best to regroup us, to get us ready for the next mission. But I could tell that a lot of the men, like me, were losing hope. I don't know how many times I told myself it would be the last fight, the last mission. I'd been wrong every time. The jungle didn't care about our plans. It didn't care that we had lost so many good men. It just kept going. That was the thing about Vietnam. You couldn't escape the reality of it. You couldn't outrun it. You had to keep moving, keep fighting, even when you were broken inside. And deep down, I knew that the worst was still yet to come. The days that followed felt like they didn't belong in time. The pain from the battle with the VC still lingered, but there was no time to grieve. The mission kept moving forward, and so did we. Sergeant Davis, despite everything, was still in charge. He had to be. It was like he was the only one left who knew how to lead. But even he was starting to show signs of wear. His face was thinner, his eyes darker, like he was living on sheer willpower. After we lost Thompson, we started moving more cautiously. I think all of us were waiting for the next attack. We didn't trust the jungle anymore, and we didn't trust the VC. I remember walking through the dense forest and wondering how many times I'd been close to death without even realizing it. The VC were experts at camouflage and terrain. They could hide right in front of you, and you wouldn't even know they were there until it was too late. But it wasn't just the VC I was worried about. The weather in Vietnam could be just as dangerous. We were already drenched in sweat, and the humidity had us all soaked through, but then the rain started. It didn't just drizzle. It poured like the sky itself was coming down to crush us. The jungle turned into a swamp, and our movements became slow, like we were wading through water up to our knees. We were on the move for days, pushing through flooded trails, the ground sucking at our boots. The rains made the air thick, almost suffocating. But the worst part was when we came across a trail. clear signs of a large VC unit. Sergeant Davis was cautious. He knew that if we moved too quickly, we'd be walking into a trap. But there was no choice. We had to keep pushing. I remember the feeling when we crossed into the area they'd been using. It wasn't like anything we had encountered before. The vegetation was unnaturally thick, almost as if the jungle itself was trying to hide what was ahead. We found their camp. It was like a scene out of a nightmare. The stench at us first, sweat molded the faint smell of death. Then the sight. Equipment scattered, old weapons left behind, ration packs, and signs of hasty departures. "Stay sharp," Davis ordered. His voice was low but clear. We all knew what it meant. This was their escape route. They had been here recently. I kept my head down, scanning the area, my hands tied around the M16, my finger itching on the trigger. You could feel the tension in the air. The jungle seemed to close in around us. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves made us jump. We moved deeper into the camp. As we got closer to a ridge, I saw movement. A figure darted between trees. My heart stopped. Was it a VC? It was too fast for me to get a clear shot, but the figure had been close enough to make my breath catch. The others saw it too, and immediately we went into position. But as we got into cover, a voice called out. Hey, is that you, Bill?" It was Dave. Dave Martin. I felt a wave of relief wash over me, but it was quickly replaced by confusion. Why was Dave here? The last I'd seen of him, his unit had been stationed in the southern part of the country. The confusion cleared as he emerged from the trees, his rifle slung over his shoulder. He had a smile on his face, but it wasn't the same easy grin I remembered. There was something different about him, something hard in his eyes. "What the hell are you doing here?" I asked, lowering my rifle. "We were sent to help," he said simply. He looked around at the rest of the men in our group, and his eyes narrowed. "You guys okay?" "We're alive," Sergeant Davis said dryly. He looked over Dave's squad, clearly reassessing the situation. Dave's squad had been tasked with a similar mission, but the VC had started using the area to resupply, and they had been pushed out. They'd been following the same trail we had, and they'd arrived at the camp right after we had. The whole thing felt too clean, too easy. There was something off about it. We set up camp there for the night, hoping to get some rest before pushing on. But that night, the feeling of unease didn't leave me. Something was wrong. There were no signs of further enemy activity, but it felt like we were being watched. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were just waiting for the other shoe to drop. Around midnight, we were all awoken by the unmistakable sound of a distant rifle shot. One shot, then nothing. It was the kind of shot that made you freeze, the kind that said, "This is just the beginning." We went into immediate lockdown, weapons up, alert to every sound. I could see the fear on everyone's faces. We were used to the constant gunfire, but that one shot felt different. It was a signal, a warning, maybe even a trap. And just like that, we were right back to square one. Davis had us hunker down, moving in groups to secure the perimeter. We weren't taking chances. It was like the jungle itself had turned on us. I spent the next few hours scanning the trees, trying to listen for anything out of the ordinary, my heartbeat thumping in my ears. It felt like I couldn't trust my own senses anymore. Was that the wind rustling the leaves? Or was it a Viet Cong soldier creeping through the darkness? The minutes dragged on, each one heavier than the last. By the time dawn broke, we hadn't seen or heard anything. But that didn't mean we were safe. Not by a long shot. The VC were experts at waiting, at hiding. And we were running out of time. Davis decided it was time to push forward again. We couldn't stay here forever. Not with an unknown enemy possibly closing in on us. I remember feeling a deep exhaustion in my bones, but there was no choice. We had to keep moving. We were in this together, even if it meant walking straight into the unknown. As we left the camp, I looked around one last time. The jungle was still as silent as ever. But in the back of my mind, I knew it wasn't over. The VC had been here, and they'd be back. And next time, I wasn't sure we'd be as lucky. We started moving again as the sun came up, but the jungle didn't feel any less suffocating. Every branch seemed to hide an enemy. Every shadow seemed to loom larger than it was. The earlier silence from the night still clung to the air, but we couldn't let it fool us. The VC knew this land better than we did. and they'd be looking for any opportunity to catch us off guard. Dave's squad joined us, and we made our way through the thick foliage, staying low and trying not to make any noise. The rest of the day passed in a blur, each step a battle, each breath a struggle. The heat was unbearable. My clothes were soaked through, and my mind felt as foggy as the air. But none of us were going to admit it. We were all too proud for that. We were soldiers, and we kept moving forward one foot in front of the other. Around mid-afternoon, we reached a small clearing. It wasn't much, just an open patch of dirt and a few sparse trees, but it felt like a safe place to rest for a while. We hadn't heard anything from the VC for hours, and that silence felt almost too good to be true. Sergeant Davis called a halt and ordered us to set up a perimeter while the rest of us caught our breath. I collapsed onto the ground, my body screaming for rest, but I couldn't let my guard down. Not yet. There was a gnawing feeling in the pit of my stomach, something I couldn't shake. Maybe it was the silence. Maybe it was the fact that the jungle felt too empty, but something wasn't right. "Hey, Carter," Dave said, crouching next to me. "You holding up all right?" I nodded, trying to muster a smile. "I'm good. Just tired, you know?" He gave me a half smile in return, but his eyes were distant. He had changed since I last saw him. I could see it in the way he held himself, the way he kept looking over his shoulder. The jungle had a way of making you paranoid, but Dave's caution felt different. He had seen something, or maybe he was just like the rest of us, forever on edge. Before I could say anything else, there was a sudden, sharp crack of gunfire from the trees ahead. We all hit the ground instinctively, weapons ready. The sound of the shot echoed in the distance, followed by a series of rapid bursts. More VC, more gunfire. It was too close. "Get ready," Sergeant Davis barked, his voice low but urgent. "They're coming for us." We scrambled to get into position, but the noise grew louder, closer. The VC had us surrounded. They were moving fast, too fast for us to get out of this one easily. They must have been waiting for us, lying in wait, just like we had feared. And now it was happening. The first wave hit us hard. A dozen or so VC fighters came charging through the trees, firing wildly. They knew what they were doing. No hesitation, no second-guessing. We were pinned down again, firing back with everything we had, but the VC were everywhere. Their AK-47s flashed in the trees like ghosts, each shot a threat to our lives. I crouched behind a fallen log, firing blindly toward the sound of the enemy. My M16 jammed halfway through, and I cursed under my breath as I yanked it back together. Sweat stung my eyes, but I kept my focus. I couldn't afford to miss. A grenade went off nearby, the blast sending dirt and debris into the air. The shockwave threw me back, and for a split second, everything was silent. My ears rang, and my vision swam. I wasn't sure if I was hurt or just dazed, but I couldn't think about that now. I had to keep moving. I heard someone shout, but I couldn't make out the words. All I could hear was the pounding of my own heart and the noise of the battle around me. I looked around, trying to spot my comrades. Dave was on the other side of the clearing, his rifle up and firing, his face set in a grimace of determination. Sergeant Davis was coordinating the defense, barking orders, keeping everyone in line. Then, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Jenkins. It wasn't him, but it was a soldier who looked just like him. A young kid, barely out of boot camp, just like Jenkins had been. He was caught in the open, moving from one piece of cover to another, unaware of the danger. I opened my mouth to shout a warning, but it was too late. A burst of gunfire tore through the air, and the kid went down, collapsing to the ground in a heap. "Medic!" someone shouted, but I knew it was too late. He wasn't getting up. I didn't have time to process it. We were still under heavy fire. The VC were pushing forward, their assault relentless. We had to get out of there. "Fall back!" Davis yelled. "Now!" We moved quickly, retreating through the trees, back toward the jungle. I grabbed my rifle and followed, my mind racing. I couldn't think about the kid on the ground. I couldn't think about Jenkins. I just had to focus on staying alive. We made it to the edge of the clearing, but the VC weren't letting up. They were pushing after us, closing in, making it harder to get away. I kept looking over my shoulder, but the trees blocked most of my view. Every second felt like an eternity. We had to get back to the extraction point. We had to survive. and for a moment I thought we might not. We kept moving, hearts pounding, sweat dripping from every pore. The jungle around us felt alive, as if it were pressing in on us from all sides. Every step, every movement felt like it was too loud, too obvious. The VC were close, and I could almost feel their eyes on us. We weren't just running from them. We were running for our lives. As we pushed through the thick brush, I could hear the crackle of radio static, and then Sergeant Davis's voice, steady despite the chaos, came through. "Alpha Squad, this is Davis. We gotta keep moving. No time to stop. Just get to the extraction point. Move, move, move." I barely registered his words as I kept pushing forward, my legs burning from exhaustion. The trees blurred around me as we weaved between them, trying to stay low, trying to make ourselves harder targets. But even as I sprinted, I couldn't stop thinking about that kid, about Jenkins, about all the men we had lost. The weight of it was too much. I couldn't let it drag me down, but it was there, always present. Dave's voice cut through my thoughts, shouting ahead. "Davis, the VC are right behind us. They're not letting up." I saw Davis turn back for a moment, his face grim. He was holding it together, but I could see it in his eyes. We had to make it out, or we weren't making it out at all. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by another round of gunfire. The first burst flew past me, but the next hit a tree nearby, splintering the bark. My heart skipped a beat. We were too exposed. We had to get cover fast. "We got to split up," Davis yelled, his voice sharp and urgent. "Take the left flank. We'll head right. Keep moving. Don't stop." We broke into smaller groups, scattering through the trees. I found myself with Dave again, our rifles up and ready. We were both silent, knowing that the next move could be our last. The sounds of the firefight echoed all around us. I could hear the snap of bullets flying through the air, the rush of footsteps in the underbrush, but I couldn't stop to think. We just had to get to the extraction point. It felt like hours as we stumbled through the dense foliage, but in reality, it was probably only a matter of minutes. Time moves strangely in moments like these. I remember the air being thick, wet with humidity, and my every breath felt labored, like I couldn't get enough air into my lungs. But despite the fear, despite the exhaustion, we kept pushing. We had no choice. Eventually, we reached the clearing where the helicopters were supposed to meet us. The extraction point. But when we got there, it was empty. I felt a pit grow in my stomach as I looked around. "No choppers. No backup." We were alone. "Where are they?" Dave asked, his voice tight with frustration. "We were supposed to be here an hour ago." Davis was scanning the sky, his face set in concentration. "Hold tight," he said. "They'll be here." But I knew, deep down, that it wasn't that simple. The VC had us surrounded. They were getting closer. If we didn't get out now, we'd be trapped. Then, the sound of a helicopter blade cut through the air. A huge sigh of relief flooded over me. I thought we were going to make it. But it wasn't just one chopper. It was 3, and they weren't coming in low. They were hovering just above the tree line, guns ready. There was a flash of movement, and suddenly, the VC appeared out of the trees, charging forward. They had gotten there first. They had been waiting for us. The choppers fired first, sending a stream of bullets into the trees. But it wasn't enough. The VC were too close, and we were too exposed. The air was filled with the roar of the helicopters and the crackle of gunfire. "Move! Move!" Sergeant Davis shouted. I ran toward the chopper, my heart pounding in my chest. Dave was right behind me, but we weren't going fast enough. I heard the thump of boots behind us, and before I knew it, a bullet grazed my leg. The pain was like fire, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. I just kept running, ignoring the blood soaking my pants. The chopper was getting closer now, and I could see the crew chief waving us in. But the closer I got, the more the gunfire intensified. The helicopter hovered just above the ground, its door guns firing wildly. I could see the soldiers leaning out, spraying bullets in every direction. I reached the helicopter just as another round hit my arm. I stumbled, but Dave grabbed me, pulling me onto the skid of the chopper. The crew chief helped yank me up, but before I could even get my bearings, the helicopter was lifting off. The jungle faded beneath us. the sounds of battle becoming muffled. As we rose higher, I looked down at the clearing below. We were leaving behind the chaos, the blood, and the fear. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. It was never over in Vietnam. As the helicopter climbed into the sky, I leaned back, exhausted. The pain from my wounds felt distant now, almost irrelevant. I closed my eyes, trying to block out the memories that still haunted me. But I knew they'd never leave. The war didn't end when you left the jungle. It followed you, deep inside your mind. And for the rest of my life, I'd carry that weight with me. The weight of the men I lost. The weight of the jungle. The weight of Vietnam.